I don't think you're too old for a dance.
Oh, you think I'm too old for this? Salvatore Vitale whispered with a dark smile, and I should have run that very same night. I accepted the job restoring paintings at his mansion because I needed to survive, not because I wanted to lose myself in the eyes of the most dangerous man in the Cosa Nostra. He was older, cold, far too powerful, and he knew how to leave me breathless without ever laying a finger on me. When his family tried to destroy me, I learned that luxury hides poison too, but the worst part was realizing that maybe I was already too close to walk away. Hi, I'm Lena. A special shout out to those of you watching Book 1 for free here on the My Stories platform, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Chapter 1. The Anonymous Collector's Collection. The eviction notice was under the door when I woke up. White paper, red ink, 3 short lines like a sentence handed down. I knelt on the wooden floor of my rented room in Brooklyn, with the gray morning light coming in through the only window, and I read it all the way through, as if reading slowly could change anything. It didn't. 6 months of back rent, 1 week to pay, the illegible signature of the landlord I'd known for 2 years. The smell of reheated coffee drifted in from the tiny kitchen, mixed with the turpentine that had never come out of the walls since I'd started using the corner of the living room as a makeshift studio. I folded the paper twice and slipped it inside a book on Renaissance art history. There was nowhere else to put it. The kitchen sink had dishes from the night before. The easel leaning against the wall held a painting I was restoring for free for a friend, and my right wrist had dried white paint on it that I hadn't been able to scrub off in the shower. I rubbed it with my thumb. The paint didn't budge. My phone buzzed against the wood of the nightstand. Julia, second voice message in 4 minutes. Bianca, answer me, woman of God. Did you go move in with some anonymous collector? Like, anonymous, without signing a written contract, without a company name, without anything. I love you, but I'm coming to get you before you climb into some black car and disappear. Pick up. I opened my mouth to answer and gave up. I shoved the phone into the pocket of the work coveralls I insisted on wearing as street clothes, slipped on the sneakers that had been begging for retirement since last winter, and headed down the 3 flights of stairs of a building with no handrail. The smell of mildew on the second-floor landing was the same as always. Even so, it bothered me in a new way, as if I were already comparing that place to another one I didn't even know yet. The car was waiting on the other side of the street, black, matte, the kind that doesn't show a plate from far away. Leaning against it stood a tall, thin man in a dark suit, hands folded in front of him, gray hair cut short. He didn't smile when he saw me. Miss Morelli, that's me. Tommaso Greco. Mr. Vitale asked me to pick you up. Mr. Vitale. It was the first time I'd heard the full name. The agency had said collector, private collection, residence in Manhattan, generous advance. They'd mentioned discretion. They hadn't mentioned a last name. Vitale, I repeated, quietly, as if testing the word. The sound of it carried a weight that had nothing to do with the wind on the street. Tommaso opened the back door without answering, and I got in without looking around. The drive from Brooklyn to Manhattan had the most polite silence I've ever experienced. Tommaso drove as if New York traffic were somebody else's problem. The car smelled of new leather and something woody, maybe the cologne he was wearing, maybe the upholstery itself. I looked out the window, my purse held tight against my lap, and tried to remember every detail of the conversation with the agency. Collector, 3 months. Italian collection, confidentiality. I had signed whatever they sent me because the advance check covered 6 months of back rent and still left enough to buy new brushes. We crossed the bridge. The river shone in gray plates under a sky that threatened rain and couldn't make up its mind to fall. We turned onto wider, cleaner streets, with well-kept trees. At some point, the streets became an avenue, and the avenue became a tall iron gate, with an olive tree carved in relief at the center. Here, I asked, before I could stop myself. Here. The gate opened on its own. The car drove in. The house appeared all at once, the way big houses have of appearing, not in parts, whole, like a decision made by someone who doesn't ask permission. Pale stone, 3 stories, tall windows with heavy curtains, a controlled garden on either side of the entrance, white flowers, a lot of white flowers, in stone vases along the path, with a discreet perfume that drifted in through the cracked window when the car slowed. Who is Mr. Vitale? I asked. Tommaso stopped the car in front of the front steps. He looked at me in the rearview mirror for 1 second longer than necessary. Mr. Vitale is Mr. Vitale. That was the only answer he ever gave me in his entire life on the subject, and I only understood the weight of it months later. I got out of the car with my purse against my chest, and my stained hands hidden in the pocket of my coveralls. The air outside had that clean coolness of neighborhoods that pay a gardener every week. The front door was open. Marta, the housekeeper, dark skirt, hair pulled back, eyes that greeted me by name without meeting mine, led me through a high-ceilinged entrance hall with a crystal chandelier and 3 paintings I recognized from my college reading lists. I stopped in front of the first one without realizing it. It was a family portrait from the late 19th century, with fine craquelure across the top and a more serious crack running through the central figure's shoulder. Restorable. Difficult, but restorable. The fingers of my right hand itched inside my pocket, the way they always itch when I see damage that calls my name. "Miss Morelli," the woman said, patient. I blinked. I kept walking. The studio had been prepared by someone who understood the craft. A solid wood central table, adjustable easels, controlled cool lighting, a chest of drawers stocked with fresh solvents and pigments, 2 paintings already positioned on padded stands. I recognized the first one before I could even think. A minor Caravaggio, attributed, with an old burn mark in the lower right corner. I recognized the second more slowly. A Florentine Renaissance piece. Workshop school, with paint loss on the Virgin's robe. I forgot to breathe. The studio air had the neutral smell of rooms that respect what they hold, and the silence was that of someone who had closed the windows thinking about pigment conservation, not the comfort of the person working there. "The others will be brought in as you request," the woman said behind me. "Mr. Vitale would like you to feel free to set the pace of the work." I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. The woman left. I stood in the middle of the studio with my purse against my chest, and the clear sense of having walked into a place I wasn't yet authorized to understand. I touched the edge of the easel with my index finger, the way you greet a big animal that might bite. I left there almost an hour later, determined to find a bathroom and breathe outside that room. I took the east corridor, the same one that connected the studio to the main staircase and, farther on, to the guest wing. Pale walls, dark wood paneling, a sequence of closed doors, and a runner rug that muffled my steps. I accidentally brushed against a frame as I passed. It didn't fall, just trembled, and stopped in front of a cracked painting that hadn't been brought to the studio, hung on the stretch of corridor that opened onto the staircase landing. That was when I heard the footsteps. They weren't hurried. They were the kind of footsteps that belong to the floor they walk on. I turned around slowly, my heart climbing into my throat before I even knew who I was turning to face. He stopped about 3 meters away from me. Dark suit, no tie, white shirt open at the first button, gray at the temples, clean-shaven, hands bare except for a discreet signet ring on the pinky of his right hand. Brown eyes that had the kind of calm that only comes after a long time spent making decisions that weigh on a man. I knew who he was before he said it. "Miss Morelli, Mr. Vitale." He looked at me with a polite slowness. His eyes traveled down from my face to my hands, which I'd taken out of my pocket carelessly when I stopped in front of the painting. White paint on my wrist, dry ochre along the side of my index finger, a greenish streak under the nail of my thumb. I felt each one of those stains weighing against my skin. I closed my hands. He didn't pretend not to notice. He brought his gaze back to my face without comment, and said, in a low voice, "I hope the studio is as you need it." "It is. If anything is missing, ask Marta. She'll handle it. Thank you." I wanted to say more. Something professional. Something to show I belonged in that corridor. What came out was, "The painting is cracked." He looked at the canvas behind me as if he had never noticed it, though I had the clear impression that he noticed everything all the time. "It is. I can restore it. I know." And that was all. He tilted his head slightly, a greeting that wasn't a greeting, and continued down the corridor without looking back. I stood there for an amount of time I couldn't measure, hands closed inside my pocket, heart pounding harder than it should have for 3 words. His scent had lingered in the air, light, woody, with a hint of something citrus that took its time to fade. I went back to the studio the way I had come. I never found the bathroom. I worked until after nightfall. I did what I know how to do when the floor shifts beneath my feet. I opened boxes of pigments, tested lights, mapped the damage on the minor Caravaggio onto a separate sheet, noted priorities. My hands stopped trembling after the second hour. My head took longer. Every time I closed my eyes to rest them, I saw his gaze sliding down to my wrists. The contract was on the central table. inside a dark leather folder. I read it once, twice, and stopped on the third page. The advance check was stapled inside. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place in my life. It was the back rent paid off all at once. I would pay the landlord the next morning and hand over the keys to my room by the end of the day. The bill for my mother's treatment, that I still owed the hospital, the breath I had forgotten how to take. I signed on the indicated line, without giving myself time to think twice. Around 8:30, I picked up my purse to leave. Tommaso's car was waiting in the same spot as that morning, low beams scoring the gravel. Before I went down the main staircase, I paused on the landing because I heard a voice coming from the room on the right, the door slightly ajar, a narrow band of yellow light slipping into the hallway. It was him. He was speaking Italian, quietly, in the tone of someone who gives instructions without needing to raise his voice to be obeyed. I didn't understand all of it. I understood enough. Portatela a cena di sabato. Bring her to Saturday's dinner. I went down the stairs without making a sound, my hand sliding along the cold banister, and the check burning inside my purse. Tommaso opened the car door as if he hadn't noticed a thing. The iron gate with the olive tree in relief closed behind us, slowly, in no hurry to return me to the street I had come from. In the back seat, with my purse against my lap and the check folded inside it, I thought for the first time that maybe Julia had been right about the black car, and that maybe I had agreed to get into it anyway. Chapter 2. Too old for this. I went back to Brooklyn the next day to pick up 2 suitcases, clothes, books, the plastic bag where my mother's dress had lived for 2 years. By Saturday morning, I was already settled into the guest room Marta had shown me on the upper floor of the mansion. The dress had been my mother's. It was the only thing I owned that looked like it belonged in a dining room with a chandelier. Black, 3/4 sleeves, round neckline, fitted waist. I had kept it in a plastic bag for 2 years, and I had learned that afternoon that it still fit. It fit less well than it had fit her the last time she wore it, but it fit. The fabric still smelled of her perfume, a hint of jasmine trapped in the fibers, and I didn't know whether that gave me courage or took whatever was left of it from me. I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror of the bedroom and tried to recognize the woman with her hair pinned up and paint scrubbed into her nails. My hands were still stained. Oil paint doesn't come off with soap. I had scrubbed with solvent, and my skin had protested in red around the knuckles. It was all still there. The ochre under the thumbnail, the green streak on the middle knuckle, and the white at the wrist that I'd come to consider part of my body. The mirror reflected back the yellow light of the sconce. For a moment, I looked older than I was, and younger than I needed to be standing there. I knocked on the door a little before 8. Tommaso was waiting in the hallway, as if he had spent the whole afternoon there, leaning against the dark molding like a statue that breathes. Signora. I'm not a signora. For now. He said it without moving a muscle in his face, and started down the corridor before I could decide whether to laugh or to be afraid. The carpet muffled our steps. The walls carried paintings of horses and of dead men, and each one of them seemed to follow me with its eyes. The dining room had even higher ceilings than the entrance hall. A long dark wood table, 12 chairs upholstered in wine-red velvet, a central vase of white flowers that I had already learned to recognize as the signature of the house. The crystal chandeliers scattered tiny points of light over the plates and across the polished tabletop. And the smell of dinner, rosemary and browned butter, drifted in slow waves from the pantry door. 5 people standing with glasses in hand when I came in. Salvatore at the head, dark suit, white shirt, dark tie this time. He saw me before anyone else. He didn't smile. His eyes went down from my face to the hem of my dress, and came back without hurry. I pretended not to notice. Miss Morelli, said a woman to his right, with the most polite smile I had ever seen. Dark hair gathered at the nape of her neck, pearl earrings, somewhere in her 40s. Giulietta Vitale, Salvatore's cousin. Pleased to meet you. The pleasure is all ours, isn't it, Salvo? Salvatore didn't answer. He pointed to the chair on his left with 2 fingers. I sat. The velvet of the chair was deeper than I expected, and my mother's dress, too long for that seat, pulled tight across my knees. The others were introduced too quickly in sequence. Don Aldo Ferri, elderly, white hair, a round belly under his dark waistcoat, small, attentive eyes, who shook my hand with a good calm and only said my name back to me. Enzo Vitale, nephew, somewhere in his 30s, wide smile, eyes that didn't match the smile. Carlo Rinaldi, older, courteous, a man who had learned at some point in life to look like everyone's father at the table. Dinner began in Italian and slid into English as they remembered I was there. I understood enough Italian not to feel completely lost, enough to notice, by Giulietta's third glass of wine, that she had decided this evening was going to be about one single thing. "Salvo," she said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, in carefully polished English. "I was telling Carlo earlier that it's lovely to see you dedicating yourself to the collection again. It's been so long." "It has," Salvatore replied, without looking up from his plate. 15 years, isn't it? Since Caterina? It has. I just think," and here she smiled at me as if I were complicit in some joke, "it's important to remember that there are phases in life. You're past the age of fooling yourself with these things. Salvo, the collection, the new project, the new woman in the studio. It looks lovely. It really does. But we know it's just collecting." The table went silent for 2 seconds. It was a silence long enough for me to hear the tick of a clock on a sideboard somewhere behind me. Don Aldo turned his glass by the stem and said nothing. Carlo offered a half-smile that looked rehearsed. Enzo seized the moment. "Miss Morelli must have a rare talent," he said, turning to me with the glass still in his hand, "to get my uncle out of his office at this hour. I confess I'm impressed. I just restore paintings," I answered, and I heard my own voice come out lower than I'd wanted. "You just restore paintings," Enzo repeated, slowly, like someone tasting a fruit before biting into it. What charming modesty. Salvatore set down his silverware. It was a small movement. He didn't slam it, didn't make a sound. He just placed it down, to the right of his plate, with the precision of someone closing a book. The fork touched the knife lightly, silver against silver, and it was louder than any words he might have spoken. "Enzo," he said, "Uncle, Miss Morelli is my guest," and that was all. Enzo smiled wider and changed the subject. Giulietta brought her glass to her lips and watched me over the wine. Carlo asked Don Aldo something about the ports. The conversation moved on like a river that had learned to flow around a stone. I lowered my gaze to my plate and realized I had hidden my hands in my lap without deciding to. The ochre under my thumbnail felt, in that instant, like the most visible thing in the world. I ate little. I smiled when I had to smile. When the coffee came, I excused myself in the best professional voice I could manage, thanked Giulietta for the invitation she hadn't extended, and left the room walking at the pace I use when I don't want anyone to notice I'm walking fast. I took the wrong corridor on purpose. I didn't want to go upstairs yet. I wanted to breathe. I ended up in front of the cracked painting, the same one from the first day. I stopped out of habit and looked at the crack the way I look at anything broken, calculating where it started, where it stopped, what needed to come before what. The craquelure was old, stable. The crack was new, but not as new as it looked. Someone had tried to fix it and given up. The varnish, under the low light of the corridor, had the tired yellow of something that has seen too much. The footsteps came up behind me. I recognized them before I turned. "You didn't finish your coffee," Salvatore said, stopping beside me, without looking at me. He was looking at the painting. "I don't drink coffee at night." "Curious. Neither do I." I looked at him. He kept looking at the painting. "Your cousin doesn't like me." "My cousin doesn't like anyone after the second glass." It was the third. He turned his face. He didn't smile, but something at his mouth moved enough for me to notice. "You count other people's drinks. I count everything. Occupational hazard." I can imagine. He stood in silence for a moment. I could feel his shoulder about 20 centimeters from mine, not touching. The corridor was wide. There was no reason for it to feel narrow, and yet it did. His scent reached me, discreet, something woody mixing with the linen of his shirt. I held my breath without meaning to. "You heard what she said." I heard, and what? He turned his body slightly toward me. I didn't move. I kept looking at the painting, because turning my head at that moment would have given away more than I wanted to. "Do you also think," he said, low, in the tone of someone testing the ice of a lake before stepping on it, "that I'm too old for this?" I swallowed hard. My hands were back in my pocket, without my having decided to put them there. "Too old for what, exactly?" He smiled then, a real smile, a small smile, dark at the corners, the kind I'd never seen on a man expecting something polite in return. He said, even lower, and now he had brought his face close enough that I could feel the heat of the words before I heard them. "Too old to make a woman lose control without touching her." I didn't breathe. It wasn't a choice. It was my body. The air just stopped in the middle of my chest and stayed there, waiting for an instruction I was in no condition to give. I looked at the cracked painting as if the crack were the only safe place in the corridor. The line of the varnish, seen this close, seemed to give me back the reflection of his face. "You're overstating your own resume." The sentence came out before I could think. It came out hoarse, sarcastic, the way I talk when what I want is to run. I heard my own voice, and barely recognized it. He didn't laugh, but the smile deepened. "Perhaps. Not perhaps. Definitely. You like big words when you're scared. I'm not scared. No." He took half a step back. It was almost worse than if he'd stepped forward. The whole corridor breathed again, and I with it, without hiding it. It was like coming out from underwater after staying down too long without realizing you were sinking. "Good night, Miss Morelli. Good night, Mr. Vitale." He continued down the corridor at the same pace as the first day. I stood there in front of the cracked painting long enough for a clock to chime the hour in some distant room. When I went up the stairs, I went slowly, my right hand running along the banister without needing the banister. The wood was cold under my palm, and that was the only real thing I had to anchor myself. The guest room had a fire lit in it that I hadn't asked for. I looked at the fireplace. I looked at the bed. I looked at the plastic bag where the dress had lived for 2 years. The flames crackled low, steady, as if someone had lit the fire less than half an hour ago and calculated it to last the whole night. I sat on the edge of the mattress and tried to remember the last time my heart had beaten at that rhythm for no reason at all. I couldn't remember. I removed the paint from my wrist with patience. With good solvent I'd stolen from the studio, and it came off. Only a shadow remained. I looked at the shadow and thought about the contract I had signed the day before, which provided for 3 months of residence in that house. 3 whole months, counted out in nights like this one. I had agreed to live for 3 months in the house of a man who spoke low Italian on phone calls I wasn't meant to hear, whose cousin had hated me the first night, whose nephew had greeted me with a smile that wasn't a smile, and who had just asked me, in a corridor, whether I thought he was too old for something he never named. I lay down on the bed without taking my hair down. My heart did not slow. I looked at the ceiling, counted the dark wooden beams that cut across the white plaster, and asked myself the question I should have asked before I signed any paper, and that I was asking now too late for the answer to matter. What exactly did I just agree to? The fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, somewhere in the controlled garden, a gate closed. Chapter 3. Coffee at 2 in the morning. The first week passed like a painting restored in silence. The second began before I realized the first had ended. By the third, I already knew the sound of his footsteps in the corridor before the studio door opened. The studio was in the east wing of the mansion, in a high-ceilinged room that someone in the family had used, in another life, as a music room. What remained were the piano draped in a gray cloth, the long windows facing the garden, and a faint smell of wax that no solvent could erase. That was where I worked. That was where he came. The light came from 2 floor lamps with yellow shades that I had asked for myself, and that gave the room the temperature of a Vermeer, half light, half shadow, and everything in between seeming to matter more than it should. On the first cold dawn of that first week, I found a basket of extra firewood resting against the fireplace in the guest room. I hadn't asked anyone for it. Marta looked at me with the patience of someone who's looked after rich people for many years, and said only that Mr. Vitale had ordered it sent up. I thanked her as if that were normal. It wasn't. The firewood smelled of fresh pine, cut to the exact size of my small fireplace, and stacked with a care no housekeeper would give without a specific order. By the second week, the vase next to the easel had fresh white flowers in it by morning, camellias and a stem of orchid. When Marta came to refresh the water 3 days later, she changed the flowers too. It happened again, and the following week, again. The camellias always arrived with their stems freshly cut on a diagonal, the way you do it to make them last longer, and the orchid was changed before the first petal had even wilted. I told Julia about it on late-night calls, with the phone tucked between my shoulder and my ear while I cleaned a brush. Julia laughed on the other end as if I'd been sent to Mars by mistake. "Bianca, honey, let me see if I've got this straight," she said, chewing on something that sounded like chocolate. "No man sends extra firewood out of charity. Extra firewood is a confession." "It's a courtesy from a boss," I answered, with the patience of someone repeating the same sentence for the 5th time. "He has a collection that includes a minor Caravaggio. Do you know how much a minor Caravaggio costs? Courtesy is part of the budget. Honey, he sends firewood because he wants to picture you sleepy. That's literature. That's the movies. That's the stuff you see and don't believe. Julia, stop. I'll stop when you stop calling me at 11 at night to describe the temperature of the room. I hung up laughing and pretended I hadn't heard, but the laugh kept rolling around in my chest for longer than it should have, and the temperature of the room, that night, I checked twice before going to sleep. The coffee came on the fourth night. I was bent over the portrait of a 19th century Vitale, scraping a layer of yellowed varnish with a precision that depended on my wrist not trembling. I heard the door open slowly behind me. I didn't turn. I already knew. The air in the studio changed. It gained weight, gained a smell of bergamot and something woody beneath it, and my wrist obeyed out of sheer pride. "You don't have dinner," Salvatore said. He spoke in a low voice, the kind that doesn't cross the room but sits close to the listener's ear. I set the scalpel aside and finally turned the stool. He was standing 3 steps from the door, dark suit, tie loosened by a finger's width, holding a small tray with 2 porcelain cups. He hadn't brought a maid. He was carrying it himself. The fabric of the suit absorbed the yellow light as if that light were too expensive to bounce off it. "I'm not hungry when I work," I answered. "You work all the time." "Convenient, then." He set the tray on the mahogany sideboard next to the door, carefully, as if afraid of waking the house. The black coffee filled the air with a smell that cut through the old wax, dense, earthy, hot enough to fog the inner rim of the porcelain. "No sugar," he said. "Tommaso told me. He lets me call him Tommy now, by the way. Says 3 weeks of serving coffee to the same person is enough." "Tommy's a traitor, then. Tommy's observant." Salvatore came close enough to leave one of the cups on the corner of my work table, away from the paints. He didn't invade my space. He stepped back even before I could thank him. I learned in that instant that he measured distances with the precision of someone who measured everything, and that exact distance seemed calculated, so I wouldn't have the chance to step back first. "I don't drink coffee at night," I said, more to fill the silence than for any other reason. "Neither do I," he answered, and left. I stared at the cup steaming for a full minute before drinking it in one too late gulp. Almost cold. It wasn't the coffee that kept me up. It was the sentence. I repeated his 4 words with my back against the wall, in the dark of the bedroom, 3 times, before I accepted that I was going to be awake until dawn. The next night, he came back. The next, too. By the 3rd, I no longer turned around. I just said goodnight over my shoulder, as if his presence in the studio at 2 a.m. were the same kind of domestic detail as the firewood and the flowers. Tommy came into the scene one afternoon, while I was rearranging the solvents in the cabinet and quietly cursing the brush that had disappeared. He leaned against the doorframe as if he'd been there for hours. I hadn't even heard him. "Signora," he said. "Tommy, may I?" "You may." He took half a step in. He looked at the empty tray still on the sideboard, from the night before. He scratched his temple with his knuckle. He was a man around the Don's age, broad shoulders hunched from a lifetime of serving, and he had a thin scar on his jaw that only showed when he clenched his chin, and he was clenching his chin. "The Don hasn't had coffee at night in 20 years. You told me that already." I told him that. "Now I'm telling the Signora." I nearly dropped my brush into the jar of turpentine. Tommy didn't move a muscle in his face. He left before I could come up with any answer that wasn't a nervous laugh. I closed the door behind him and rested my forehead against the wood for a full second. The wood was cold. My forehead wasn't. "It doesn't mean anything," I told myself. "It means the man changed a habit. Habits change. People change habits for 1,000 reasons. None of them have to be me." I believed that sentence for the next 3 days. On the 4th day, Salvatore came into the studio at 2:04 a.m. with the tray and found me crouched on the floor, picking up a tube of white paint that had rolled under the table. I got up quickly and shoved both hands into the front pocket of my coveralls before he took a second step. He noticed. I knew he noticed because his eyes went down to the pocket and came back to my face without any hurry at all. He had a way of looking that didn't weigh. It just settled and stayed as long as it wanted, as if his time were a different time. "Why do you hide your hands when I come in?" "I don't hide them, Bianca." The first time he said my name alone, without the last name, was that night. I registered it the way you register a small earthquake. The name came with a weight on the middle syllable, as if he had thought about it before saying it, and it occurred to me, with a jolt, that maybe he really had. "They're dirty," I answered. "It's ugly. I saw your hands the first afternoon. I saw your hands at dinner. You restore paintings, Signora. Your hands aren't ugly. They're the reason you're here." I didn't know how to answer. I took my hands out of my pocket slowly, with white paint at the corner of my thumbnail, and gripped the edge of the table so I wouldn't tremble. The wood was smooth from so many elbows, so many decades, so many women before me who had leaned whole lives there. Salvatore crossed the 3 steps between the door and my table. He brushed my wrist lightly with the tip of his index finger, a fraction of a second, just long enough for his skin to touch mine and pull back. He didn't turn the hand. He didn't hold it. It was almost nothing. And it was enough for the warmth of that minimal touch to be marked on my wrist like a signature. Don't hide them anymore. He let go, stepped back, left without the coffee. I stood there with my hand in the air for a length of time Julia would later classify as embarrassing. The weeks kept going by that way, in small erosions. I learned the passage that connected the studio to the library from the inside, discovered that the kitchen had a side door to the garden, came to know the old greenhouse where Donaldo would show up to tend 2 rose bushes with the patience of someone praying. One afternoon, he found me there looking at the closed buds and spoke about the paintings the way you speak about your children. The greenhouse smelled of wet earth and a flower I couldn't name, and the light slanted in through fogged glass as if it, too, were afraid to intrude. "Mr. Vitale loves the masters," said Donaldo, without looking at me, pruning a dried leaf. "But not the way rich men love them. He loves them the way men who have lost things love, looking a lot, touching very little." I didn't answer. Donaldo went on pruning. The shears made a dry sound with each cut, decisive, like a punctuation he controlled alone. I left the greenhouse without understanding whether it had been a warning or a key. Enzo crossed my path 3 times that same week, always in places I didn't expect. The library door, the kitchen corridor, the curve of the staircase. Smiling too much, asking slowly about Brooklyn, about college, about my mother. I answered in monosyllables and changed the subject. Something in him made me want to keep all my sentences locked in a safe he would never find. On the night of the 3rd week, I was finishing the restoration of the lower corner of the portrait when I felt the studio's air change before the door even moved. He didn't bring a tray this time. Salvatore leaned his back against the wall next to the door, hands in his pants pockets, and stood in silence long enough for me to set down the scalpel and turn around completely. His silence had a volume of its own. It was a silence that pressed on your chest until you breathed deeper, just to push it back. "I'm tired," he said, low, "of pretending I come in here just for the paintings." The sentence landed in the studio like a stone in still water. I opened my mouth to answer, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. He waited exactly 3 seconds for my answer. When it didn't come, he tapped the doorframe once, lightly, with his fingertips, and left without waiting any longer. The door closed behind him with the same care as always. I sat on the stool, staring at the wall where he had leaned, realizing that my hands were trembling for the first time in all those late nights, and it wasn't from the cold. The extra firewood burned in the small fireplace in the corner, generous, scandalous, shouting a confession I had spent 3 weeks pretending not to hear. Chapter 4. The Necklace in the Purse. Friday arrived with a low end-of-afternoon light coming through the guest room window as if it wanted to prepare me for something. I didn't know what. I only knew I had been invited, by the voice of a maid who barely met my eyes, to the formal 8 o'clock dinner. The sun cut across the oak floor at an oblique angle, orange, and the suspended dust looked like molten gold falling slowly over my shoes. Outside, the garden was beginning to settle into silence, with that kind of quiet that precedes the cold of a late autumn New York night. I put on the second decent dress I owned, black, simple, closed up to the neck. I pinned my hair with 2 old clips that had been my mother's, and my fingers lingered longer than they should have on the darkened metal. I looked in the gold-framed mirror leaning against the wall, and barely recognized myself in the reflection. My hands, washed 3 times with the olive oil soap the housekeeper had left in the bathroom, still carried a trace of Prussian blue at the joint where the thumb meets the palm. I didn't hide it. I remembered his sentence in the studio and left it visible, the way you leave a small flag flying in a corner of the window. Julia had warned me by voice message at lunchtime. "I'm feeling something today. Bianca, I'm feeling it. Call me afterward. If I don't pick up, it's because I fell asleep, but call." I laughed at Julia the psychic, standing on the stairs with the phone in my hand, and went down the staircase with that feeling that has preceded all the beautiful mistakes of my life. The mahogany banister was cold under my palm. The portraits of the Vitale ancestors followed my descent with eyes that seemed to have been painted to watch whoever was coming into the dining room, not whoever was leaving. The formal dining room had been set for 9. The crystal chandelier hung above the table like a constellation of suspended drops, and the light it cast over the linen tablecloth looked wet. Giulietta off to one side, in a wine-colored dress and her usual smile. The smile she applied to her lips like another layer of lipstick. Enzo on the other side, close to the head, swirling his glass with his middle finger, making the wine spin against the crystal wall. Carlo Rinaldi, seated further toward the middle, courteous, greeting me with a slight nod. Don Aldo near the window, hands folded over his round belly. Two new capos to me, Renzo Marino, short and broad-shouldered, and Bruno Lazzari, taller, grayer, who introduced themselves with the same economy of words as Tommy, and Salvatore, at the head, in a dark blue suit, a thin tie, a gaze that took me in completely before I'd reached my chair. Tommy was standing near the service entrance. He didn't eat with the family. That night, it was his presence that steadied me in the first few minutes. He met my eyes a single time, and in that single look, there was a warning I didn't know how to read. I sat to Don Aldo's right, according to the place marked by a dry ink card with my name written in slanted handwriting. My bag, a small black clutch I'd brought only because my phone fit inside it, ended up next to my chair, on the floor, leaning against the leg of the furniture. The smell of the room was a mix of floor wax, rosemary from the roast and the dry, woody perfume I'd already learned to recognize as his. The aperitif began with Carlo talking about a spring auction from years past, in a calm voice, describing a Caravaggio that had changed hands in London for a figure he mentioned as casually as the price of bread. Giulietta laughed at some private joke with Enzo, tilting her neck in a way that showed her collarbone. Salvatore looked at me over his wineglass twice, and both times I looked away toward Don Aldo, who asked me about the paintings as if the room weren't full, as if that were one of those conversations you have in the kitchen in the morning, with coffee and the newspaper. It was in that moment that Enzo stood up to grab an olive from the platter in the middle of the table and, as he leaned in, bumped against my chair. The clutch tipped over. The contents spilled across the Persian rug. Phone, key, lipstick, 2 brushes wrapped in paper towel. The fine bristles of the brushes lay exposed, and I felt a silly tightness in my chest, as if they had dropped a small piece of my work on the floor of a house that wasn't mine. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice too loud for the table. "I'm clumsy, signora." I crouched down to gather everything. He crouched with me. His fingers brushed against the strap of the clutch before mine did, and there was a quickness in that movement that didn't match the rest of his body. I didn't think anything of it. I picked everything up, closed the clutch, set it back on the floor. When I sat down again, I realized my heart was beating a little louder than was appropriate, without knowing why. The soup arrived, golden and hot, with a thread of green olive oil drawn in a spiral on its surface. The second course came. The wine was poured again, a dense red that left a tear-shaped trace on the glass. I had almost managed to breathe normally again when Enzo, holding his glass, said to the table in a measured voice, "Uncle, you know that sapphire necklace that disappeared from the house safe last week?" Salvatore didn't answer right away. He set down his fork. The sound of the metal against the porcelain was dry, exact. He looked at his nephew for a full second. "I do. I think I found it." Enzo bent down, with a theatricality that only became obvious afterward, and pulled from under my chair, with 2 fingers, a necklace of large blue stones that gleamed in the chandelier's light, as if it were part of the centerpiece. The sapphires looked like sips of deep ocean caught in claws of old gold. The entire room froze. Giulietta caught her smile between her teeth. Carlo set down his glass with studied calm, without the liquid swaying inside the crystal. Don Aldo closed his eyes for an instant, the way someone recognizes an old move on a board he's already seen. "It was tangled in the strap of the signora's clutch," said Enzo, and he made a point of pausing before the last word. "I hope it's a mistake." I stood up. I didn't decide to. My legs decided for me. The linen napkin slid from my lap to the floor and was forgotten there, white against the red of the rug. I looked at the clutch on the floor, then at the necklace dangling from his index finger, then at Salvatore. "I didn't take that," I said, and my voice came out firmer than I'd expected. No one answered. The silence settled over the table like a third tablecloth, heavy, smothering even the tick of the wall clock in the hallway. I looked at Salvatore again. I waited. His eyes were fixed on the necklace. His jaw had hardened. His fingers rested on the white tablecloth. Still, open. He didn't close his hand. He didn't stand up. He didn't speak. 1 second, 2, 3. I counted to 5 before I understood what was happening. That he was thinking. That he was, for the first time in 4 weeks, weighing something against me in his head. That his silence was a whole sentence. And that sentence, written in the air between us, hurt more than anything Enzo had laid on the floor. Salvatore, Giulietta said, soft, patient, the way one speaks to a child about to break a glass. Maybe it's better for the girl to explain with more time. Somewhere else. That was the sentence that unlocked his. Enzo, Salvatore said at last, in a low voice that cut across the table. Put that necklace down. Uncle, I was only. Put that necklace down. Enzo opened his fingers. The necklace fell onto the tablecloth with a small chime, muffled by the linen, and lay there, coiled on itself like a blue snake. Salvatore looked at me. He opened his mouth as if he were going to say something, but it was already too late for any sentence to undo the silence that had come before. No, I said, my chin too high for the room. Not now. I already understand. Bianca, I don't need a powerful man, I went on, my voice trembling in a way I controlled by keeping my hands flat on the back of the chair. If he is weak in the face of a lie. Carlo lowered his eyes to his glass. Giulietta lost her smile entirely, and for a moment her mouth was exposed as it really was, a thin line. Donaldo looked at me with something that, later, I could only call pity with respect. Tommy didn't move from the doorframe, but I felt his presence steady itself behind me like a wall, and never in my life had I been so grateful for a wall. I picked the clutch up from the floor. I didn't run. I crossed the room straight down the middle, passed through the double doors, and the heels of my shoes against the floor made a sound I would never forget. I went up the staircase without holding the banister. Behind me, I heard Salvatore say my name once. I didn't answer. I heard his chair scrape back. I didn't turn around. In the upstairs hallway, the air came back. It rushed into my chest the way it does for someone who has dived too deep. That was when I realized I had forgotten to breathe between the necklace and the staircase. I went into the guest room, closed the door, and for 2 whole minutes I stood with my back to the wood without being able to move anything but my eyelids. The wood was cold against my shoulder blades, even through the fabric of the dress. From outside, downstairs, came a murmur that had started up again, voices low, civilized, picking the dinner back up as if nothing had happened. And that resumption wounded me in a new way. Then I went to the closet. The doors creaked softly. I took out the 3 pieces that were truly mine. I folded the work coveralls, the smell of turpentine and linseed oil still embedded in the seams. I folded the second decent dress. I folded the nightgown that had cost more than I cared to admit. My hands, now out in the open, trembled so much that the blue paint on my thumb seemed to move on its own, alive, like a tiny piece of sea escaping my skin. I called Julia. She picked up before the second ring, as promised. Bianca, Julia, you're crying. No, you're crying. I realized I was, slowly, without a sound, without a sob, just water running down my chin while I zipped up the suitcase. The mouth of the suitcase closed with the sound of tired fabric, and I thought, without wanting to think it, that was the sound of my goodbye. Come get me in the morning, I asked. I'm coming now. No, in the morning. I need to stay tonight. I need to learn to leave without running. Julia stayed silent on the other end, long enough for me to know she had understood everything. I heard her breathing, slow, held against me like a hand on my shoulder from a distance. In the morning, she said. 7 o'clock. I'll stop at the corner. You come down with the suitcase. Don't look back. I won't look back. I hung up. I sat on the edge of the bed with the closed suitcase next to my foot, hugged my knees, and finally let the blue paint on my thumb get wet with the tears I hadn't shed when the necklace dropped to the floor. The room was almost dark. Only the desk lamp was on, and its yellow light made the striped wallpaper look like a cage drawn with patience. It was in that silence that I heard the footsteps in the hallway. They weren't his. His footsteps I already knew, heavy on the ball of the foot, slow on the heel, with the time of a man who has never needed to hurry in his own house. These were lighter, shorter, hesitating every 3 steps, as if whoever was walking were rehearsing the sentence that would come after the knock. They stopped in front of my door. I held my breath. 3 knocks. Pause. Enzo's low voice, on the other side of the wood. Bianca, open up. I can explain. Chapter 5. The Silence That Hurt More. The knock on the door came firm, 3 times, with the weight of someone trying to seem worried. Bianca, it's me. Open up, please. Enzo's voice on the other side carried a layer of sweetness that didn't match anything that had happened that night. I was sitting on the floor, leaning against the bed, with the suitcase closed beside me, and my hands so caked with dry paint that they looked like they had aged 10 years in 2 hours. I didn't answer. I just watched the latch, checking for the third time that it was locked, and silently counted the steps that separated my bare feet from the nearest light switch, in case I needed to turn it off. "I know you're awake," he insisted. "Lower. Let me explain something to you. There are details you didn't see. The room, which for weeks had been the quietest place in my life, now seemed to have been invaded by a sound that came from outside and from inside at the same time. The fireplace had gone out hours earlier, and the air carried the residual smell of cold firewood, sweet and burnt, mixed with the gardenia perfume someone had set on the dresser. I got up slowly, barefoot on the cold rug, and approached the door without making a sound. I rested my forehead against the dark wood and breathed through my nose. The smell of furniture polish blended with the expensive cologne he had worn at dinner, and that closeness made me nauseous. "Go away," I said, low but clear. "There's nothing you can explain at this hour. You're making a mistake leaving like this. My uncle is a complicated man. The sentence died in his throat. I heard other footsteps in the hallway, heavier, rhythmic, unhurried, like someone who had walked that floor for years and knew every board that creaked. I pressed my ear against the door and felt my heart climb to my temple. Step away from that door. 2 words. Tommy. Nothing more was needed. There was a silence of the kind that seems to carry weight, dense as wet velvet, and then the sound of Enzo's breath losing its steadiness. He tried to laugh, and the laugh came out cracked, like glass scratched from the inside. "Tommy, I just came to talk to the girl. You heard what I said." Tommy's voice was the same as always, without inflection, without emphasis, and for that reason more dangerous. Enzo's footsteps moved away, uneven at first, faster later, until they turned into a poorly concealed hurry. When the hallway returned to silence, I rested my palm against the door and heard, on the other side, Tommy's dry voice in a tone that wasn't meant for me. "Signora, I'll stay here until dawn. If you need water, knock on the door once." I didn't answer. I backed away to the bed and sat down, and the mattress sank under me with a muffled sound that seemed louder than it was. That was when I understood, for the first time, that Salvatore had sent someone to protect me without my knowing it. At some point between the accusation in the dining room and the moment Enzo decided to try the lock, that thought wrapped itself around my chest in a way I couldn't name at the time. It was care, yes, but it was also confirmation that he knew, before I did, what his own blood was capable of. I didn't sleep a single minute. I watched the light in the room change from blue to gray, and from gray to the pale tone that comes before sunrise. The heavy curtains filtered the brightness into long bands on the rug, and I followed the advance of those bands as if time were something you could measure in centimeters of floor. Every hour I thought about unpacking. Every hour I gave up. What hurt me most wasn't the accusation about the necklace. It was his hesitation. 5 seconds of silence at the head of the table, with 5 people watching me, and I saw in Salvatore Vitale's eyes a doubt he would never have shown over an arms order. In front of me, he doubted, and that doubt echoed inside my chest like a bell from an empty church. Around 7 in the morning, I heard muffled voices on the floor below. I couldn't make out words, only the timbre, Salvatore's among them, deeper than the others, leading. Someone answered briefly. A door closed with more force than necessary. I got up. I washed my face in the sink of the ensuite bathroom, and the cold water hit my swollen cheeks with an honesty that hurt. I looked at my paint-stained hands, and, for the first time in years, didn't try to hide anything. I put on my coat, adjusted the collar in the fogged mirror, and picked up my suitcase. The leather was cold against my palm, faithful, the way things that belong to you usually are. When I opened the door, Tommy was standing on the other side, with the same posture of someone who had stayed there a whole night without moving, his jacket immaculate, his tie in place, his chin freshly shaved. He didn't comment. "The family has been called to the parlor," he said only. "The signore asked that the signora come down as well, if she wishes. If she doesn't, I'll take the suitcase to the car." I gripped the handle of the suitcase tighter, feeling its weight pull my shoulder down. "I'll come down." I crossed the hallway with the sound of my own steps hitting the damask-lined walls. The old Vitale family portraits watched me from inside their gilded frames, serious, motionless, as if none of them had the right to weigh in. I went down the marble staircase, holding the banister with the hand that wasn't carrying the suitcase. The chill of the stone climbed up my palm and stopped at my elbow. The family parlor was full, Giulietta sitting in the first armchair, her hair pinned up however it would go, without the makeup from the night before. Don Aldo standing by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching as if the sun in the garden were more interesting than anything that might be said in there. Carlo Rinaldi seated in the armchair at the back, one leg crossed, his hands resting on his knee with the calm of a man with nothing to fear. The two capos, Renzo and Bruno, standing against the wall, broad-shouldered, eyes lowered, presence trained not to weigh on the room. And in the middle of the parlor, Enzo, still in his rumpled clothes from the night before, trying to keep his chin up. Salvatore was by the cold fireplace, dressed as if he had never slept, probably because he hadn't, his white shirt buttoned to the last button, his cuffs precise, the watch in its usual place. His eyes were the first to find me when I came in with the suitcase in my hand. He didn't try to smile. He didn't try to fix anything with a gesture. He merely registered my presence, lingered a tenth of a second on the handle of the suitcase, enough time for me to know that he had understood every single thing that suitcase meant, and turned to his nephew. "You spent the night recorded, Enzo." The sentence came out without any anger, and that was exactly why I saw Enzo's face lose its color, slowly, from his temples down to his chin. "Uncle, Shut up." Salvatore crossed the room to the side table, opened the laptop that was already waiting there, and turned the screen so everyone could see. I didn't have to come closer. From Giulietta's reaction, a hand to her mouth, a small choked sound, I understood what was being shown. Footage from the cameras that had been erased and that he had recovered overnight. Enzo in the hallway by the safe, 3 days earlier. Enzo at dinner, sliding the necklace onto my clutch strap while pretending to help me pick up my things from the floor. Enzo handing an envelope to the security guard on the upper floor, with the nervous haste of someone who didn't yet know how to be corrupt properly. "The man you bought has been in the garage since 4 a.m, said Salvatore, and finally looked at his nephew. He confessed everything. Amount paid, date, motive. You wanted to sit in this chair sooner than life was going to offer it to you, Enzo, and you decided that destroying an innocent woman was the shortest path." Giulietta opened her mouth and closed it again. For the first time since I'd known her, she didn't have a ready sentence. Her fingers trembled in her lap before lacing themselves together tightly, as if one were grabbing the other so neither would run away. "You're out of this house," Salvatore continued, in a flat tone, "without title, without protection. The omertà doesn't cover those who betray their own blood for a step up. Tommy will walk you to the gate. If you ever come near her, I'll come for you myself." The last sentence came out lower than the others, and for that reason it hurt more. In me, in him, in the whole room. It was the first time Salvatore Vitale was saying in front of his family what he felt, without saying it in so many words. Enzo opened his mouth to beg. He looked at Carlo Rinaldi, the way one looks for an ally. Carlo lowered his eyes to his own knee and said nothing. His fingers remained in the same position, too calm, too trained. I noted that small gesture without understanding what it meant. I just filed it away mentally, the way I file away cracks in an old painting, without quite knowing why. Tommy passed by me without touching me, placed his hand on Enzo's shoulder with enough weight for the young man to understand, and the two of them left through the side door. The sound of their footsteps going down the side corridor faded until it became nothing. Giulietta stood up slowly, came over to where I was standing with the suitcase, and, unable to find words, simply inclined her head once. It was the only apology that woman was capable of giving, and I accepted it with another tilt of my head. I saw that she wanted to say more. I saw her swallow it. I saw her leave without trusting her own voice. Don Aldo came over to me last. He touched the back of my stained hand with the tips of his wrinkled fingers, in a gesture that felt more like a blessing than a greeting. The Signora honored this house last night. He left without waiting for an answer, walking slowly, with the short steps of a man who has already seen many rooms like that one, and has walked out of every one of them without looking back. Salvatore remained by the fireplace. I looked at him for the first time in a whole night. He waited, without moving, without leaning his body in my direction, giving me what he didn't know how to give almost anyone: time. I picked up the suitcase and crossed the parlor in the opposite direction from his og, without looking back, toward the garden. My low heels struck the marble with a dry sound that stayed in the air an instant longer. The air outside was clean, with that cold that burns the lungs before noon. Dew still glinted at the tips of the grass, and the smell of wet earth rose mixed with the lavender that the gardener kept along the path. I walked across the lawn to the stone bench by the fountain. I set the suitcase down beside me. I sat. The stone was cold through the thin fabric of my coat, and I was grateful for that. I needed something concrete against my body. My hands rested at the height of my knees, stained, trembling a little. The fountain sang that low, continuous sound that tends to make silence easier to bear. I heard his footsteps behind me, unhurried, rhythmic, familiar now. Salvatore stopped 3 meters away, within my peripheral vision, without invading the space of the bench. I didn't come to ask for easy forgiveness. His voice carried a new hoarseness, the kind that comes from a whole night without speaking. I pressed my hands together, feeling the dry paint tug between my fingers. I came to ask you to listen to the reason I hesitated. The sunlight struck his face, and I noticed for the first time that he hadn't slept either. There was a new tiredness in his eyes, a man's tiredness, not a Don's. I looked at the fountain. I looked at the suitcase. I looked at my own stained hands. I thought about how many times in my life I had decided alone, in the dark, what was safe to feel. I thought about my mother, in the hospital room, about the checks I had never been able to pay in full. I thought about the man standing 3 meters away from me, who had spent the entire night searching, in some cold server, for the truth he could have accepted in me at the table and hadn't. "Sit down," I said, without turning my face. He sat at the other end of the stone bench, leaving between us the space of a whole life. I waited. Chapter 6. The Night No One Saw. I stayed alone on the stone bench for a few hours. The sun rose to the top of the wall, then began to drop on the other side, and at some point in the afternoon, it must have been close to 3, I heard footsteps on the gravel behind me. Salvatore had taken the whole morning to come. He didn't begin with the apology. He looked at the fountain for a long time, his hands resting on his knees, his shoulders heavier than I had ever noticed. The water fell in a thin thread over the stone made green by time, and the sound was like a fine rain that couldn't decide to fall all the way. When he finally spoke, his voice came out lower than I had ever heard it. When Enzo opened his mouth last night, I knew in half a second that he was lying. In half a second, Bianca, I didn't doubt you. You stayed silent for 5 seconds. I know. He turned his face toward me, without coming any closer. There was a shadow of stubble on his jaw, the sign of a night he had spent standing, and his eyes were darker than usual, as if sleep had been left outside the house along with Enzo. It wasn't a lack of faith. It was the fear of finding out that, if I defended you too fast in front of those people, you would realize the size of what I felt, and that you'd leave because of that, instead of staying for the right reason. I closed my eyes for a moment. The sun on my face, warm, still low, the sound of the water behind us, the smell of the white flowers growing along the garden wall. It was a sweet, dry smell, the kind that clings to your clothes hours later. I thought about every hour of the past weeks in which I, too, had calculated distance so as not to be seen too much by him. About every time I'd hidden my hands behind my apron. About every cup of coffee that had gone cold while I pretended to work. "And you made the wrong calculation," I said. "I made the worst calculation of my life." I opened my eyes. He was looking at my hands, not at my face, like someone who understands exactly where the most fragile part of a person is. "I'm tired, Salvatore. Not of the house, not of the work. I'm tired of being too proud to receive care. I'm tired of calculating distance. I don't know how to do the opposite." He didn't answer right away. He breathed through his nose, slowly, and I saw his breath adjust itself to mine, as if even that he had learned to do in silence. "We learned together," he said at last. "I don't know either." He stretched out his hand, without moving from where he was, and left it open in the space between us, on the stone. His palm was wide, marked by deep lines, with a thin scar on the mound of his thumb that I had never had the courage to ask about. He demanded nothing. I looked at his palm for long seconds. I promised nothing. I placed my paint-stained hand inside his. His fingers closed slowly, with the kind of care you have with a piece you know is cracked. "Today," I said. "Only today. Tomorrow we'll see. Today is enough." We stayed on the stone bench until the sun crossed to the other side of the garden. The stone warmed under my skirt, then cooled again when the shadow of the wall fell over us. At some point he stood up, took the handle of my suitcase without asking, and walked with me back into the house. There was no one in the hallway. I think Tommy had led the rest of the family into some other room, with that silent skill that was his trademark. That night, the 3 of us had dinner in the small kitchen at the back, not in the formal dining room. The walls there were whitewashed, low, with old shelves of dark wood and ceramic jars worn down by generations of hands. Tommy served a simple pasta, with butter and sage, the kind that smells like somebody else's childhood. He sat down with us, made exactly 2 dry remarks about the wine, and listened more than he spoke. Julia called me in the middle of dinner. I answered in the hallway, leaning against the cold wall, feeling the stone floor chill the soles of my feet. I told her in 3 sentences. She breathed deep on the other end. "Stubborn," she said, with affection. "Call me tomorrow." She hung up before I did. When I went back to the table, Salvatore had taken off his jacket and folded it over the back of the chair next to him. The sleeves of his shirt were loose around his wrists, no roll-up, and that seemed more intimate to me than it should have. Tommy was washing the dishes with the naturalness of someone who had been doing it since before I was born. We went up the stairs together, without hurry, without conversation. Each wooden step creaked in a different note, and I counted them, because it was easier to count wood than to think. He stopped in front of the door of the master bedroom, not the guest room. He rested his hand on the frame, looked at me, and asked in the lowest voice in the world, "Do you want to come in?" I looked at the door. I looked at him, at the line of his jaw I had learned by heart in those 3 weeks of 2 a.m. coffees, at the first row of white hairs at his temple that I had never had the courage to touch. "I do." He held out his hand. I took it. The door closed behind us without a sound. The kitchen was full of sun when I came down the next morning. The light came in through the low windows in wide bands, hit the old tiles and spread across the floor with a Sunday laziness. Even though it wasn't Sunday, I was wearing one of his shirts that covered more than it should have, and less than I would have chosen. My hair loose, my feet bare on the stone floor, cool under my soles. Salvatore was already there, barefoot too, pouring coffee as if that scene were an old one, as if for years he had been waiting for me to appear in the doorway of that worn wooden frame. The smell of black coffee, strong, mingled with that of butter melting in a forgotten pan on the stove. Tommy came in through the pantry door carrying a basket of bread, paused for a 1/10 of a second when he saw me, and kept going as if nothing had happened. "A good morning, signora." The naturalness with which he said it made me want to disappear inside Salvatore's shirt. I brought the cup to my lips to hide the smile. The hot rim burned slightly, and I let it burn, because it was preferable to the urge to laugh. Salvatore, on the other side of the counter, watched the way I held the cup, with both hands, stained with the previous day's dry paint, in full view. He didn't comment. He just, for a second, turned his face toward the window, and I saw in him something that didn't yet have a name, a kind of smile from within, the kind men like him only allow when no one is looking. Tommy set down 2 slices of bread on his plate, without asking, and left through the same pantry door. We were alone. The silence between us was different from the silence of the past weeks. It weighed less, and even so it took up more space. "I have to go to the studio this afternoon," I said, my mouth full of coffee. "The painting in the hallway. The cracked one. That one." He nodded slowly. He said nothing more, but I saw his shoulders drop 1/2 centimeter, as if something very old had finally found a place to rest. He placed his cup on the counter with exaggerated care, like someone who had learned early not to make noise in the house. Later, after coffee, I went up to the guest room where I had lived for the past weeks to pick up what was still there. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, and the room already had the still air of rooms where no one sleeps. I began moving the few things I had brought into the master bedroom. Not all of them at once. Only what felt right to take now. The hairbrush, 2 books, the envelope from the hiring that I had kept in the top drawer of the dresser. I stopped in front of it. The paper was thick, yellowed at the edges, and the name of the intermediary company was printed in discreet letters in the corner. I had never sent a resume to that company. Julia, at the beginning, had laughed at it on the phone, saying that no one hires anonymous, that there must have been a referral. My name was already on that list before any resume had even been sent. I thought about going downstairs with the envelope in hand and asking, right there in the kitchen, how my name had ended up on that page. I looked at the envelope. I looked at the door. I put the envelope at the bottom of the drawer of the new dresser, underneath the other things. I pushed the drawer with the tip of my finger until I heard the wood click into place. When I turned around, Salvatore was leaning against the doorframe of the bedroom, a vase of white flowers in his hand, and the kind of look he only had when he thought no one could see him. I smiled. I'd ask another day. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. All I had was the desperate belief that someone had finally chosen to love me, until a broken frame revealed the truth that destroyed everything. I found the execution order for my father, signed by Salvatore Vitale. The same man who warmed me in the early hours, who kissed the back of my neck while I slept, and who swore that I was the only good thing in his life. The same man who ordered my father's death when I was 12 years old, who tore my family away from me. Every kiss turned to poison, every touch, a betrayal I'll never be able to wash off my skin. Every "I love you," whispered through lies. I ran from that mansion with my heart bleeding and my soul in pieces, trying to hate him with everything I had. But the worst wasn't the hatred. The worst was discovering that, even knowing all of it, a part of me still wanted him. And now the filthiest secrets of the Cosa Nostra are coming to the surface. Names, trafficked children, empires built on innocent blood. And who was behind it all? You can imagine. But now someone is willing to kill to keep them buried. Someone who already knows that I've found out everything. Someone who saw me at the gallery. Someone who left an envelope with a single photo of me and that note that sent chills down my spine. So, when the truth finally explodes, it may already be too late to save our lives, or to save what's left of a love that should never have existed. And now Salvatore would have to choose, protect me or protect his empire. Like I said, that was just a taste of Book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and Book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side. Unfortunately, many people have been downloading our audio, effectively copying the entire story, and simply reposting it on YouTube. If you want to watch the original story and be the first to receive the next ones, search for My Stories by Lena on YouTube to get the best dark romance content. Remember, the official channel is My Stories by Lena on YouTube. I'll be waiting for you there. Congratulations! Your purchase has been confirmed, and you now have full access to Books 1 and 2 of all our stories, completely ad-free and uninterrupted. Everything is available on the My Stories platform, from Mafia Romance and Billionaire Romance to our spicier tales. This content is ready for you now, with new episodes added daily. Access is simple. Just log in using the same email address you used for your purchase. A confirmation has also been sent to that same email. The My Stories platform is very simple and intuitive. Each image represents a story. If it has a Book 2, just click and press play. Everything is already unlocked for you. You can also rate each story, leave a like, and write a comment. Your feedback will be visible to all our other subscribers. This is our romance universe, so please feel free to interact. From this moment on, this is officially your home for romance stories. Just head over to mystoriesromance.com and press play. Welcome to the family.